So today we are going to be talking about writing romance as a main plot and a subplot. Now the reason why is because it is a beneficial thing to the genre. I know not everyone's going to write that, most people generally try to avoid the romance subplot because ew, gross romance. But ultimately I felt like it was an important lesson to go over and talk about due to the fact that a lot of people do like having their romance subplots and their romance main plots. And even if you don't have romantic plots in there, you can still benefit to learn from how these kinds of relationships work in writing in a, more structural way. Because a lot of people think, oh, romance is one thing, romance is another thing. There is a specific structure to writing romance well. If you don't use the specific structure, it can sometimes not feel like romance. It can just feel off, and readers can sense if it feels off. So this is going to be helpful for also, I believe, writing friendships and also making sure you're not accidentally writing romance. If you want to avoid it and you're like, hey, character A and character B could have some potential romance later, but right now they're just friends, and you want to make that clear, today we're going to talk about what makes it look romantic so you can avoid that. So you can also think about it as this is things to avoid if you don't want romance to be a part of your subplot. So you can either take it as here's what to do if you want romance, or you can take it as here's what not to do if you want to avoid it. Alright, so the first thing, sorry, I'm used to having my whiteboard, so transitions are rough right now. The first thing that is important if you're doing romance, or to avoid if you're not wanting to do romance, is to make sure that the two of them are both emotionally compatible as well as physically attracted to each other. Now, if you're just emotionally compatible, that's when you get just good friends. Like Harry and Hermione. They're just good friends. Why? Because they emotionally can relate to each other. They emotionally can sympathize with each other. They have comforted each other in times of need. They have helped rescue each other, like when she was paralyzed in book 2, and different things like that. So it's just, you can see the friendship connection is primarily an emotional thing. It's when you're lifting each other up, right? And you're supporting each other, and you're there for each other, and you want to make sure that you both know that you're there for each other. That's important, absolutely. But when it becomes more romantic is when you're more physically attracted to each other as well as emotional. If it's just physical, this is when you get into the it doesn't feel real, they just want to kiss each other. That's not romance, that's just weird. That's the point when you're like, why are we doing this? You want to make sure that yes, they are physically attracted to each other. They do want to kiss each other, but they also are emotionally compatible. Like, again, with, instead this time, Ron and Hermione. With Ron and Hermione, in the beginning, they were just friends, right? You felt that emotional connection. They were dorks sometimes, that you have dirt on your nose. They were kind of dorky. But when you could tell when it switched into romance because Ron started looking at Hermione more often, and instead of just being like, oh, you're my friend, whatever, he was like, no, actually, you're really pretty. And that's when you could tell, oh, this has changed, this has evolved, this has made it into the romance category instead of the just friendship category. So again, if you're trying to go for just friends and avoid the romantic aspect, I would say avoid describing them physically from the other person's point of view. For example, if it was my point of view and I'm just hanging out with one of my friends, I wouldn't go, luscious soft lips and golden blonde hair. No. If they're just my friend, I probably wouldn't even think twice. I'd just be like, whatever, they flip their golden blonde hair and sassiness or whatever, cool. That's more of a chill thing. Once you start describing it poetically and like intensely and staring at them, that's a problem. You've crossed a line. You need to make sure that if they're staying in the friend zone, you don't cross that physicality line. Because that's when the reader starts getting cues of, oh, romance. And so if you're not trying to do romance, that's when you get the weirdness of, hey, I think they're romantically interested. And you're like, no, they're not. And your readers are like, well, but it feels like it. You don't want to confuse them. It's important that emotion equals friends, physical equals infatuation, and both is where love connects in writing. So you got to make sure you have both if you're doing both, and just emotion if you're doing friends. Now, if you're doing infatuation, that's an entirely different thing. That's more like, oh, I think I'm in love with so-and-so, and then later it turns out they betrayed me. That's more where you get infatuation, because they don't really know them emotionally, and they're like, I'm in love, and the other friend's like, no, you ain't. He totally gonna betray you. So if you're going for the betrayal arc, where, you know, they're just using them, then absolutely go for the all physical and no actual emotional. But that's because you want to make sure it's clear they don't know anything about them really. They don't really have a real connection. And so when that betrayal comes, you're all like, oh, we saw it coming, but also sorry, bud. That way you can have those counterbalances, so to speak. All right, the next thing is make sure to build things up slowly. Now, I know some of you might be like, for those of you on the video who are thinking about doing romance, well, there's a difference between slow burn and more quick-paced love. Yes, true. However, insta-love is not something I like to do. And most of the time, it's not things that people like to read. Yes, that can happen. Yes, can there be people who meet and then 2 weeks later they get engaged? Yes, it's happened. We live in Utah especially. You've probably heard lots of stories like that. But that doesn't mean that that's always the case. And most people like reading the slow, well-paced romances because of the fact that that tends to be the average. It's kind of like your average math problem. Using average a lot. There's this middle ground where almost all the data intersects, right? And then there's this way over here and this way over here. Now, way over here is like they've been dating for 20 years and still haven't decided to commit to each other. That's when you're like, okay. This is where it's like, yeah, it's slow, it's well-paced, it's romantic, you know, it's building, but it's not 2 weeks and we're engaged. 2 weeks and we're engaged is on this side. So there's somewhere in the middle, and the reason why people like it is because most people are in the middle. So some people do like the insta love stories, but that's because they're in the minority end. If you want to cater to the minority, that's great, go for it. But realize that most of the largest portion of your audience for romance is going to be in this average middle, where it's somewhere between a year to 5 to 6 years, depending on the couple. So, that being said, slow burn is when it's on this lower end. That means that it's taking more like 5, 6 years to get together. Sometimes if you're doing a romance as a subplot, this is when it's like, we thought about dating, and then the world blew up, and now we have to focus on survival instead. And so it's a slow burn because there's constantly stuff getting in the way, not necessarily because they don't want to get together, but because the world keeps exploding. That's more slow burn. Whereas well-paced is more like, I'm interested, the interest builds, and then we end up together. Instead of, boom, we're together. That's insta-love, like I said. It's okay if you want to do that, but just realize that you are catering to a very small audience.
I'm glad they didn't do that in Keepers of the Lost Cities.
Yes, I agree. Keepers of the Lost Cities does a very good job of doing well-paced slow burn, where it's like this subplot of romance where you're like, will she date him? Will she not date him? You know, it adds some spice and flavor to the novel without being like, oh, I'm in love with you. Let's run off into the sunset. Yeah, I agree. Not my favorite thing, but if other people like it, you go for it. Like, whatever. But it's not, I agree. I'm glad they didn't do it in things like Keeper of the Lost Cities. Especially if it's a subplot, insta-love is not good. In my opinion, insta-love is only appropriate if you're doing a romance novel where the whole point is it's insta-love, but then everything keeps getting in the way and preventing them or making the relationship complicated or things like that. Whereas with subplots, it's important to make sure that the romance is not the center of attention. And with insta-love, it tends to make the romance the center of attention. So it's important to make sure it takes a back seat, especially if you're doing fantasy. So I agree, Keeper of the Lost Cities is great, well-paced. All right, especially considering the fact that I've gone to several of her author signings, and almost every single one, someone asks, who is she going to end up with? And she's like, I don't know, man. Sophie's going to decide. Sophie's got to make her own decision. It's like, well, that's helpful. But in some ways, that's what makes it so good, is she's letting the character naturally, organically decide instead of forcing one on her, which is what makes it so well-paced and good. All right. So, next thing that we're going to talk about is internal and external complications. You got to make sure that you have both, especially in a just romance novel. Now, when it's a subplot, external is easy, right? Like with Keeper of the Lost Cities, the external conflict is very obvious because that's the main plot. Whereas the internal conflict is more of the, oh, I don't know how I feel about not having, my parents are technically my real parents, and blah, 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 all the complications. Those are more of those internal problems, right? And therefore the romance blends with that because that's an internal problem. It's not like, oh, if I don't choose someone to be with, the world's gonna end. No, it's not. She'll be fine. But it does add a complication, a complexity that makes you go, ooh, intriguing. So it's important to have both internal and external, but especially with just romance plots. If you're writing a strictly romantic plot, you gotta make sure you do internal and external complications, because most people only focus on the internal of, hey, guess what, I like you, but I don't, but I do, but I don't. And it's like that, you give me a headache. Whereas if you have the external complications, it makes it more complicated naturally. So for example, you could have the classic enemies to lovers. You know, the reason why this works is because generally it's like, oh, well, we're both competing for the same internship or something like that. And so it's not that you hate each other, it's not that you're enemies, it's more that, you know, you're both competing for the same position, so you kind of have to dislike each other because you're like, oh no, if she gets the internship, I don't, kind of a thing. And so as a result of that, it adds that external complication factor, whereas the internal is more like, ooh, they're attractive and I might actually like them, but I can't like them because they're also rivaling for my internship, and how dare they? They know I've wanted this all my life. You know, that adds extra complication to the relationship instead of just being like, oh, we're happily together and that's great and all, but we read romance because it has a plot and we're constantly wondering, will they get together? Including with romance subplots, we're thinking, will they get together with the subplot? But if you only have internal or only have external, it doesn't feel real enough. It feels like, oh, well, of course they're going to get together. There's no tension. Okay, moving on. It would be like if Keeper of the Lost Cities, they were like, here's the bad guy. You know exactly who the bad guy is. Now go get him. It's like, I'm bored now. There's no mystery. There's no intrigue. There's no, who are they? Who am I? You know, it doesn't spice things up. It's just like, go get him. It's boring. It's kind of, it's simple at best. And these things are all acceptable if you want to do simple plots for things like kids. If you're doing like 8 to 9-year-olds, absolutely having like, oh no, the goblin stole the fairy gem, we gotta go get it back. Simple plot, sure. But that's for 8 to 9-year-olds. We're talking about actual complex novels that aren't just for 8 to 9-year-olds. All right. Next thing is creating tension. Now, as we talked about, you gotta have internal and external complications. So some ways that you could create these internal and external complications are, like I said, enemies to lovers, so they're both competing for the same thing. A lot of people think enemies to lovers is like, you're the person who betrayed my whole family, now I fall in love with you. No. That's improperly done. No one would actually fall in love with someone who murdered their whole family. I'm sorry, and if they do, they're crazy, they're insane, there's another problem. There's problems there. But I've seen some people who've tried to write this because they're like, it's true enemies to lovers, and it's like, oh. That's not, you know, the whole idea with enemies to lovers is that they're competing for something, therefore they're enemies, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have to be enemies. So for example, they could be both competing for the same, like I said, the same position in a job, or they could both be competing for a place on a soccer team, or they could both be competing to become, I don't know, homecoming queen and king, something. But the point is that it makes it complicated because they're against each other, but they don't really want to be against each other. That's the main thing. They don't really want to be against each other. If they're actually against each other, there's bigger problems. Alright, the next two is going to be misunderstanding and confusion. Now, I know a lot of people don't like the miscommunication trope. However, it is realistic. There are going to be miscommunications in a relationship. Why? Because I have my point of view, they have their point of view. That's just always going to be the case. Sure, some people are going to have more misunderstandings and some people are going to have less misunderstandings. And sometimes, yes, there will be things like Jane Austen where you're like, come on, if you just actually talked to each other, all this would be solved. Well, back then especially, you couldn't really just go talk to a guy. It wasn't appropriate for a lady to just be like, hey, what's up? So that's more of a problem. Whereas nowadays, instead of back then, it's much less of a problem, right? Because guys and girls are more on equal footing now. Not entirely, but most of the time on equal footing. As a result of that, we're like, hey, I have a problem, let's talk it out. Whereas with Jane Austen's time period, there was a reason there was a lot of miscommunication tropes in the Regency era. Why? Because women weren't allowed to talk to men without seeming scandalous or wanton or problematic. And so that's why it was such a big thing. Yes, the miscommunication trope is still absolutely a thing, though. It is just more of a complex thing than it was back then. Instead of, oh, well, I wrote him a letter, but he never wrote me back. And secretly she doesn't know that his handmaid, tore it all up because she's jealous. And so it's not as much a miscommunication there as it is like a drama. But with miscommunication tropes, they can actually be done well. Because misunderstandings do happen in relationships. However, you gotta make sure that the misunderstanding is large enough to actually impact their relationship. You wouldn't have two people, unless they seriously have problems, in which case they should not be together. You wouldn't have two people be like, I really love these roses. And the other person's like, well, I hate roses because I'm allergic. I can't date you. Yeah, I think you can't date for other reasons, if that's the case, because that shouldn't be the breaking point of your entire relationship. Is something that small. Now, if it's something drastic, like, hey, I've been looking for my parents my whole life because I'm an orphan, and then you found my biological parents and then didn't tell me, now that's a big issue. Now that's something where you're like, okay, I'm a little upset at you. That makes sense. But you gotta make sure that it's those big things with the miscommunication trope. Generally, with the littler things, people shouldn't be getting that upset and that worked up. And if they are, there are other problems that they need to discuss and work through and talk about. Now, confusion is another great one. This one is especially a popular one for people who are of different genders and sexualities, where it's the whole, am I actually gay or am I not, and different things like that. That can be a fun one to play with just because it's so real. Sometimes it is hard, especially in today's society, wondering about those kinds of things and having those confusing moments where you're like, what's going on with me? I don't know what's going on. That's a very popular one in the genre right now. I would say it's almost oversaturated, so I wouldn't super go for that one. If you're gonna go for confusion, I would go for more of the Keeper of the Lost Cities confusion, where it's like, well, they're both good choices, so now what? They both have their good and bad sides, so I'm confused. That's okay. I think that one works out a little better. With the sexuality one and the confusion, it's good, and it's very real, but it has been a little overplayed. You might want to try to do something a little unique to spice it up. Alright, now we're going to go over the actual plot for a romance. Do you mind closing your So, with this one, again, this is mainly for a main romance. Sorry, my lips are so dry. It's fall. So, we're going to go over a plot for a romance. Now, when I say a plot for a romance, can be a subplot or can be a main plot. However, if you are doing it as a subplot, it's going to take far longer to reach all of these points. Because if it is a subplot, it's not the main center of attention, therefore it's going to be kind of off. Whereas if this is the main plot, it's going to follow more of the 7-point plot structure. So it's kind of depends on what you're doing. If you're doing main, then definitely follow more of this to a T. If you're doing subplot, you can stretch it out over the whole series if you want to. That's ultimately what Keeper of the Lost City's done. When I read these off to you, you'll be like, oh yeah, this book did this book did this. So it's like each book takes another step in the romance plot. Instead of having the romance plot each book, it's more like each book is a step forward. And that one can be very beneficial because then it keeps people reading for another reason that isn't just the external conflict. it adds a complexity that makes people go, well, you know, I'm kind of getting bored of the external conflict, but I really want to see who she ends up with, and that's why this adds an extra dimension. All right. So with the plot, we have the introduction of the two characters and the main character's main conflict. This can be internal or external. Generally, if it's a romance, it is an internal conflict that you're going to want to deal with. If it is a subplot, then it's going to be the external conflict. So like with this one, you're going to introduce the two main characters, and then you're immediately going to go, hey, the world's exploding. That's going to be your external conflict if you're doing a subplot. If you're doing a main plot, you could do, oh, well, I don't think I'm lovable because secretly I'm a vampire. That's an internal conflict. That's your own problem rather than someone else's problem. With this one, you're going to want to make sure that this is done within the first chapter, preferably within the first page. If you don't introduce what the main conflict is for them, whether it's internal or external, by the first page, when doing a main romance plot, you're going to lose your reader real quick. Because the whole point is you've got to introduce that intrigue that makes us want to keep reading. Because with romance, you don't got, most of the time, you don't have car chases and you don't have explosions and things like that. Most of the time, with a main romance plot, it's more like, ooh, will we get together? Will we not get together? It's more the drama that you're following. So if you don't introduce that internal/external conflict right from the beginning of the romantic novel, then you're going to lose readers. However, if it's a subplot, you can wait a little bit before you introduce the two main characters if you want to. You can introduce the main conflict and then introduce the two main characters like 4 chapters in. That's more acceptable. Alright, now if you're doing a main plot, the next thing you want to do is show why they aren't together yet, but that there's potential. You want to make sure that they see that there's potential to be together. Because if they don't see a reason for them to get together, why keep reading this romance novel? If you're like, oh, well, they're not going to end up together, what's the point of reading it? The point of reading a romance novel is to see person A and person B fall in love and get together. So if you don't see any of that potential, why read it? So in this case, you're going to want to do this about 10% of the way into the novel. Some people, you can do it earlier, more like chapter 2 or 3, or you can do it later, more like chapter 5 or 6. But I would say don't go too far into the book before introducing this potential, especially if it's a main plot. If it's a subplot, take as long as you want. But if it's a main plot, it's going to be much more of a problem if you don't introduce that earlier. Now the next one is you want to do something that forces your characters to interact at this point if you're doing a main plot. Or if you're doing a subplot, you want to make sure that all their external conflict makes it so they have to interact. You know, they have to be together. Or that they're friends, and so they want to spend time together. But secretly, does she want, like with Keeper of the Lost Cities. That makes it so that they want to spend time together because they're friends. But there's also alternative reasons. That being said, sometimes in a romance novel, especially if you're doing things like enemies to lovers, you're going to have to force them to do something together in order to get them to start working together. So for example, if we're both going after the same internship like earlier, well, have them be competing so hard for the same internship that they keep ending up at the same places. They both go to get the boss coffee at the same time. And they're both like, no, I'm getting the coffee, back off. That makes it so they're forced to interact instead of just, oh, yes, I'm applying for the position and you're applying for the position and we don't even interact. You've got to make sure there's interaction and you've got to make sure there's potential to create that sizzling drama of chemistry that people enjoy so much. Now, the next thing is about a fourth to a third of the way into the book, you got to introduce the other conflict, whether it's internal or external. So if it's a subplot, that means that you introduced your external first. That means that you're going to want to introduce your internal now. That means it's going to be complicated by whatever emotions are going on inside you. Whereas if it's the romance and you introduce the internal first, now you need to introduce the external. So this would be the case where it's like, my internal conflict is, I'm a vampire and I don't know if anyone will love me. But the external conflict is, I just lost my job and the only job that I can find is during the daytime, and now I look super sketchy wearing 7 layers while I go to work. I don't know, something like that. Some sort of external conflict that makes it like weird and complicated and interesting. It makes it so that it's more than just I have problems internally. It's I have lots of problems now that we got to solve together. So a great example of this is called I think it's called The Proposal. I could be wrong, but it has Ryan Reynolds and Sandra Bullock in it. I think it's PG-13, so I don't know. But don't watch it if you don't think it's for you, because it does get a little sketchy, but that's because it's PG-13. But the idea with The Proposal is very much this, where the internal conflict is that she is kind of a very rude person, but that's mainly because of the fact that she's had to fight for every position that she's ever gotten. And now she's a CEO, and she's so excited. And she's like, I'm a CEO of this company, it's so successful, I feel good about myself. And then the people walk in and they say, guess what, you're from Canada, and your visa's about ready to expire, so either you get married to a US citizen, or we're shipping you out. This company's gonna go to someone else because you gotta go back to Canada. And she goes, oh crap. So it takes the internal conflict of, hey, I'm kind of a terrible person because I've had to claw my way to the top, and it complicates it even more and makes it so that then she has to go to her singular male secretary and say, hey, can we pretend to get fake married so that way I can stay? It's a funny movie. But anyway, again, it might be too adult for you guys, so don't worry about it. But the point is, that's the concept. With that being said, it's a great example of showing the internal of, hey, I have problems, to showing the external of, now I really have problems. And it makes things extra complicated, and that's what we love about romances, is that you're taking something that could have been simple and you're just exploding it into all this possible drama. Because that's what people like in romances, is drama. Now with a subplot, you generally do the external first, so then you show the internal. This is when you show the tender side of your main character, where it's like, now that everything's not exploding, I'm actually really sad and I have problems. And it makes your characters relatable. Alright, so moving back into more points on the plot end. The next thing you're going to move on to is a false low or a false high. Or you can do both. Both is harder though. Generally you want to pick one or the other. So a false low is when it seems that the relationship is doomed. It seems like there's no possible way they could get together for whatever reason. So whether it's, hey, we're separated via a prison camp and now you're on the other side, false prince, but anyway, where they end up getting separated by a prison camp, and it's like, oh no, will we even make it out of this alive? That gives you the sense of a false low. You're like, I don't know if we'll make it through this, and it seems like the relationship is doomed. Or you give them a false high, where it seems like nothing can stop them, they're the perfect dream team couple, and then you smash it all down. Why do people like this? Because again, it creates more drama, it creates more intrigue, it makes them want to keep reading and make them go, oh no, they almost made it. So, the next plot point here is whatever is keeping them apart, if it's a false low, is relieved and they're able to be back together again. Or if it's a false high, whatever was pulling them together, something is revealed that compromises it. And they're like, oh no, we're only together because I didn't know that so-and-so was alive, and technically we're engaged, and so we can't be together, for whatever complicated reasons. This is going to help give an extra complication, so when they get together at the climax and decide we really want to be together and our love is stronger than whatever we're facing, that makes it all the more special, and you go, oh, that's when you have those cute moments when you're like, yes, yes, so excited. If you're not feeling that moment, it's probably because they missed this false low or false high. That helps add that extra tension. Now with a subplot, the false low or false high can be smaller because you don't want it to take over the main plot. If it takes over the main plot, you got other problems. So you got to make sure that this false low or false high is smaller. So a false high, for instance, might be more, with a romance subplot, might be more of like, hey, we're together and everything's going well. Oh no, the wedding ring got lost and your grandmother refuses to let us get married if we can't find that ring, or something like that. That's a smaller complication, right? Lost wedding ring is a smaller complication. Whereas a false low example might be, hey, I don't know if this is going to work out because I'm too afraid of losing you, and I gotta have nothing to lose if I'm going to do this final battle thing. And so that's more of a smaller false low, where it's like you don't really have to break up, but at the same time I see why you feel like you have to. And so as a result of that, it still stays in its subplot lane, so the main plot can keep moving. Because the problem is if you interrupt that, if you subvert it and make it so that subplot comes up here and main plot ends up down here, it ends up getting all tangled and mushy, and people don't like it. People like their main plot to stay the main plot and the subplot to stay the subplot. You don't want the subplot eating the main plot. We've discussed this. Or at least I think I've discussed it in one of my videos. If you haven't seen it, please feel free to go back to the YouTube channel. I think I have a full video on not having the subplot dragon eat the main plot. I was taught that one at an L2E conference, and I thought it was a really great way to show that you don't want your plots getting entangled. Alright, so the next thing that you're going to want to do in any good romance is obviously the climax, where, like I said, they decide their love is stronger than whatever they are facing. So with this, you generally if it's just a romance, either the external conflict kind of resolves itself, or the internal conflict ultimately ends up being overcome. Basically, both conflicts have to be overcome for them to get together in this climax. Whether it's an overcoming of the mind and they just decide you matter more to me than whatever external conflicts I'm dealing with, or whether it's a subplot and they're like, hey, even if we're going through all this crazy crap, I would rather go through all this crazy crap with you than without you. That's more of a subplot romance thing. Now, that being said, the final conclusion, and this wrapped up a lot sooner than I thought, because I thought we'd have more people here today, because we have like 2 or 3 people who really like writing romance in here, but they're not here today. Alright, is when we see them happily together at the end. Now, with a subplot, this could be forever. You could not have them get together until the very, very end of the series with a subplot. You could wait forever. Now, to be fair, I will say this frustrates some readers. I have this one book, Ian Quicksilver, by Allison Peterson. I would highly recommend it, but it's book 3. They are super in love with each other, and they still haven't kissed. I'm a little upset. So you can continue to just put off their happily ever after until the very end of the series if it's your subplot. Yes, you can. However, just keep in mind you don't want to frustrate your readers too badly. Because if you frustrate them too badly, they don't want to keep going. They give up in frustration and just have a frustrated fit and sit down. They're like, no, why do I want to keep reading this? You keep almost putting them together and then you betray me, author. So be careful of that with the subplot. You want to make sure that they do eventually get together and that you have promises of them getting together. You don't want to have to keep putting it off. Or you want to make sure that age is a factor, like with Keeper of the Lost Cities. They make sure that it's very clear that they probably aren't going to get together for a while because they're elves and they live longer than most people. And so as a result of that, they're probably not going to get together for a very long time, if at all. Well, they will, I hope. Otherwise, that would be a terrible romance subplot. But it's probably not going to be till the end of the series, right? Because age is a factor. Now, if age is not a factor, they're both adults or for whatever reason, it can make it a little different if you're doing a subplot. But if age is a factor, that can help, kind of like with Harry Potter, where it was obvious that Hermione and Ron were not going to get together until the very end because age was a factor. So as a result of that, maturity is an issue there. So that's something to keep in mind if you're doing subplot. However, if you're doing main plot, generally we want to see them happy together at the end of book 1 because that's why we read the book. We read the book to get that happily ever after ending by the end of the book. If you want to be like, we're happily ever after, but then my long lost lover walked in. You can do that if you want to do a series and complicate things, but then at that point it's more of a soap opera. Nothing wrong with soap operas, but that's just what it is. Alright, any particular questions about how to avoid romance or how to better write romance, considering that only took 30 minutes because I didn't have a whole bunch of questions like I thought I was going to. No questions? Okay, sweet. Alright, well, if there are any questions that the other teen authors that I know that are around here might have, because I know some of you do like writing romance into your plots, and if that's the case, and you just missed today for whatever reason, please put your question down in the comments below so I can answer it, and thank you so much.